Shabbat Shalom. I'm Cantor David Proser from Kempsville Conservative Synagogue, Kehillat Bet HaMidrash in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And this is our Torah portion of Shabbat, Saturday, April 17th, 2021, corresponding to the 5th day of the Hebrew month of Iyar, 5781. We thank Rabbi Joseph Prauser, Rabbi Adam Rosenbaum, Rabbi Paul Kaplan, Rabbi Joyce Newmark, Dr. Alan Cooper, and the United Synagogue Torah Spark series for their various teachings and publications on this week's Parsha. This Shabbat, April 17th, we read a double portion from the Torah, Parshiot Tazria-Metzorah. Tazria begins on page 649 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 460 of the Hertz. This week's double dose of purity laws is unlikely to top anyone's list of favorite Torah portions. These two Parshiot are also perhaps the most difficult Torah portions for us to understand as we examine them through a 21st century lens. While the laws may be discomforting and obscure, they are also fundamental to an understanding of biblical theology and anthropology. Nevertheless, I feel sorry for any bar or bat mitzvah student that has to give a Devar Torah about either of these two Parshiot. And just as last year, some of the topics discussed should certainly evoke more empathy for those that were affected by quarantine and isolation from the community during the COVID crisis. We certainly are thankful that we can see light at the end of that tunnel. Do keep in mind, however, that throughout this Parsha and the next, we are concerned with ritual purity and impurity, the ability to participate in the Mishkan and the temple sacrifices. We focus on the ritual, not the medical aspect of the topics. An impure person may not be guilty of any offense against God, as is true in the laws that we are about to examine that deal with illness and natural physiological processes. Nevertheless, such impurities threaten the status of the entire community if left unattended. The concern of both the Torah and the people is to safeguard God's presence among the people. The Torah reading begins with a discussion of the offerings a mother was to bring after childbirth to reestablish her ritual purity. The customary requirement was a sacrificial lamb. If the mother was of limited means, 2 pigeons or turtle doves could be brought instead. The sacrifices are brought following a period of ritual impurity, 33 days after the birth of a male child and 66 days after the birth of a daughter. The requirement of circumcision for a male child on the 8th day is also mentioned here. The remainder of the Parsha deals with rash decisions, pardon the pun, with a priestly diagnosis of various skin afflictions to determine whether a person might have leprosy. Let me here emphasize that this is how the biblical term for the affliction known as tsarat is generally translated. But it is now recognized that it is not necessarily the condition that's today known as Hansen's disease. This misunderstanding may be traced to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Torah. The priest would determine if the person would need to be isolated. The procedure that restores those afflicted with this condition to purity and allows them back after the forced separation from the community is also taught. An Israelite declared leprous must rend his clothing, uncover his head, cover the upper lip with a veil or a mask, and call out, unclean, unclean. This self-stigmatizing proclamation, quite in keeping with the mournful nature of the accompanying rituals, serves to warn fellow Israelites not to approach for fear of immunological or ritual contamination, according to Rashi. Another interpretation from the Talmud, Tractate Chunim, page 77b, is, "He shall make known his affliction so that others may pray for him." The Parsha goes on to discuss the priestly identification and purification or destruction of clothing and fabric affected by tsarat, wool, linen, and leather. The second Parsha, Metzorah, beginning on page 660 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 470 of the Hertz, continues the laws of ritual impurity begun in Parshiot Tazria. The Parsha opens with God instructing Moshe how the priest should help reintegrate the recovered person into the community. God explains that the priest should go outside the camp and see if the affliction has been healed. Chapter 14 includes a priestly ritual manual for the diagnosis of tsarat, various forms of skin disease, again, usually translated as leprosy, but the rabbis felt that this condition was not merely physical, but spiritual, caused by gossip. The mechanisms by which a person so afflicted may regain a state of ritual purity and be readmitted to the mainstream of the community are described. The details include sacrifice, shaving of bodily hair, sprinkling of blood and oil, and the immersion of the person in water. Sefer HaChinuch, quoted in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, says the leper who bathed his body in water was not simply cleansing himself. The bathing symbolized rebirth and recreation. While this ceremony might strike us as odd, messy, and inaccessible to our modern mindsets, Rabbi Melissa Crespi suggests that even today, a ceremony of recovery for those who survive a life-threatening disease could be a meaningful way to welcome them back into the community. The recovery sacrifice included the slaughter of a single bird and the freeing of a second, which seems to prefigure the Yom Kippur ritual of the scapegoat, to be found in next week's Parsha, Acharei Mot, and also read on the morning of Yom Kippur. Chapter 15 explores the laws of ritual purity in detail as they pertain to bodily discharges, both normal and those deemed abnormal as a sign of illness. The effect upon a person of contact with such an impure discharge or with certain inanimate objects such as fabric, earthenware, or bedding is also detailed, and so is the effect of contact with the bodily fluids themselves. The Parsha also addresses forms of tsa'arat that appear in building stones and plaster, house leprosy, possibly meaning mold, mildew, or fungus. This part of the law would only apply to houses built after the Israelites settled in the Promised Land. The householder is required to talk to a priest who will order the home to be emptied of its contents. The priest would perform an elaborate inspection, scraping and replastering walls and removing afflicted stones as needed. In extreme cases, after a second inspection, the house could be razed. The Haftorah for this week is from the book of 2 Kings, chapter 7, verses 3 to 20, found beginning on page 675 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 477 of the Hertz. It tells about an incident in the life of the prophet Elisha during the siege of Samaria. It's a story of reversals. Lepers, the outcast of society, become heroes. The invincible army of Aram disappears overnight. The besieged, starving city of Samaria is rescued by a surplus of food. And just as it becomes clear that the horrors of the war are over and all will be well, the aid of the king of Samaria is fittingly trampled to death by his own people. Shabbat Shalom, good Shabbos. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, and feel free to leave comments below. Shabbat Shalom.